The Trump administration stated that this new measure will ensure that applicants brought in by companies are highly skilled and non-replaceable by American workers. Now remember that the H-1B visa is among the highly sought visas for entry into the United States, and thousands of Indians, in fact, in the US enter through the work visa, which is sponsored by American companies, mainly of course in the IT sector. Let's in fact also listen in to what the US president had to say.
One of the most abused visa systems in our current immigration system has been the H-1B non-immigrant visa program. This is supposed to allow highly skilled laborers who work in fields that Americans don't work in to come into the United States of America. What this proclamation will do is raise the fee that companies pay to sponsor H-1B applicants to $100,000. This will ensure that the people they're bringing in are actually very highly skilled.
Sean, do you agree with that?
Well, they're $100,000 per year. So the whole idea is no more will these big tech companies or other big companies train foreign workers. They have to pay the government $100,000, then they have to pay the employee. So it's just not economic. If you're going to train somebody, you're going to train one of the recent graduates from one of the great universities across our land. Train Americans, stop bringing in people to take our jobs. That's the policy here. $100,000 a year for H-1B visas, and all of the big companies are on board. We've spoken to them about the gold card.
They love it. They love it. They really love it. They need it.
We'll also see my colleague Priyanka joining us on the telecast now. Priyanka, I wish to understand from you. We just heard Donald Trump as well as his administration talk about how they believe in training Americans instead of getting people from outside and, giving them jobs that they believe rightfully belong to Americans. I also wish to understand from you that, 70% of the applicants are Indian, and the number just grows exponentially over the years. Now, what sort of a conundrum are we looking at?
Well, this executive order is really a disruptor, Reed, because it completely alters the cost-benefit calculation for U.S. employers by imposing the $100,000 annual fee per H-1B visa holder and applying that even to renewals. The administration is essentially discouraging companies from relying on foreign talent, particularly in tech, in research, in higher education. And the new gold card residency option, which costs approximately $1 to $2 million, reinforces the idea that only the very wealthy or the extremely high value workers will be able to secure permanent status. Now, this impact will obviously be the sharpest for Indian professionals. It's an executive order, so the courts can challenge it. But until a decision in the courts is reached, which could take a year, 2 years, 3 years, 2 months, nobody knows, Trump can go ahead with this. And this will directly impact the Indian professionals working here now on H-1Bs, which make up nearly 70% of H-1B recipients. So for many, renewals will suddenly become financially impossible for employers, which creates a real risk of all of these workers losing their legal status and families being forced to leave the United States, in some cases, even years after building careers and lives over here. Now, in addition to this, Reed, the business implication of this is significant. Companies that rely on skilled H-1B workers, especially in the tech and innovation sectors, and companies that everybody knows of, right? Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet or Google, Apple, Meta, Intel, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, right? They may decide it's cheaper to expand overseas than paying these fees. This weakens America's long-standing competitive advantage in attracting global talent. Indians will not want to come over here. So as you said, the number is rising right now. The H-1B applicant pool may be less in the coming years if it's so hard to get in. It could slow innovation, research, and growth in areas that the U.S. has historically led. So politically, this move is likely to energize Indian American advocacy groups, put pressure on Congress to intervene. You'll probably see that happening after this executive order is signed. Legal challenges are also very likely in the courts because such high fees could be challenged as unlawful or discriminatory. In the meantime, uncertainty will be the biggest factor. Families will be left in limbo. Employers may begin hedging their bets by looking abroad. So in short, the order is framed at protecting U.S. jobs, but in practice, it also risks shrinking America's talent pool, much of which is Indian talent, pushing opportunity elsewhere and straining relations as our trade talks are going on between US and India with highly skilled immigrant community, the Indian Americans that has long contributed to US economic strength and disproportionately so as well.
Right, absolutely, Priyanka. In fact, you've raised certain important points, and you've also mentioned the possibility of this, in fact, being counterintuitive for the U.S. economy. We also have Ronak T. Desai joining us. He's a visiting fellow at the Stanford University. Now, sir, going across to you, I also wish to understand from you. My colleague was just telling us about how it could possibly be counterintuitive, and how at the present stage we have about 70% applicants that are Indians. The number, of course, grows. We have companies that are sponsoring these visas, but she's also talked about how this may even discourage them. 85,000 of such visas are given out every year, but she's talking about how the number could even go down. And I wish to understand from you, a lot of Indians are employed in such sectors that, require such a visa. So in your understanding, what are the possible immediate ramifications of this?
Yeah, so I think, look, this represents a seismic shift. It's one of the most significant changes we've seen in a US visa regime probably in decades. Given that something like 70% of the H-1Bs are going to beneficiaries from India, what we're likely to see in the immediate effect, I think, is threefold, right? First, as your colleague just pointed out, we're going to immediately see some legal challenges. There's questions that persist on whether or not the president is within his authority to restructure the H-1B fees in this way. I think, two, it's going to prompt some very immediate reaction from the various companies who are the sponsors of these H-1B visas, whether or not this is ultimately going to be in their economic interest to continue bringing folks over from the Indian subcontinent who, very much constitute such a critical source of their workforce. I think the third thing that we're likely going to see in the immediate term is what this means for US-India relations. This is taking place and unfolding against a backdrop of fluctuations in bilateral ties. The last 90 days or so have witnessed bilateral relations between the US and India ebbing and flowing. There have been some tensions. There's been some issues here. I think this is now going to further be viewed within what it means for US-India relations going forward.
Right, absolutely. So you mentioned something extremely important. You talked about how India-US relationships. Of course, this also comes in the backdrop of course, tariffs. India is in the process of in some ways negotiating with the US. But of course, we've had a rocky relationship with the US in the past couple of days. So as per you, as per your able understanding, what are the possible ramifications that this could have on Indo-US relations?
Yeah, I think, look, Delhi is going to very much evaluate what this ultimately means. The H-1B has been such a critical pipeline of people-to-people ties between the two countries for the past 25 years. People-to-people ties have always been ahead of even the public sector in terms of fostering and encouraging and strengthening US-India relations. The question that ultimately presents itself is whether or not this move is going to be construed, A, as a direct attack against India at a time when trade negotiations between the two countries are ongoing. India has been targeted with 50% tariffs. It's amongst the highest in the world of the US tariff regime. Both leaders of both countries have been saying they're looking ultimately for a way to diffuse and de-escalate and find an off-ramp. Both leaders have reaffirmed their personal commitment to one another and that a trade negotiation and a trade deal will ultimately be fruitful. This introduces a new variable into the larger backdrop of what's going on. It introduces a new variable into the decision-making of what deal will ultimately materialize and how the Indian side will ultimately construe this move by the president going forward, especially when a deal has yet to be concluded.
Right, absolutely, sir. You've also mentioned certain extremely important points about how, this could also, in some ways, add up to the friction that's already there between the two countries. I also wish to understand from you from the perspective of somebody who's already there on such a visa. Now, if a sponsor does not come forth, and of course, if a company is not willing to give out this amount of money for an employee, then what essentially does happen to the employee that's been employed there? And like Priyanka was, of course, mentioning earlier, does this not, like you mentioned, that that it may not be in the company's economic interest to go forth with bringing more employees into the country and giving such a hefty amount. So what essentially happens when it comes to business within the US?
Yeah, and if we look at this from the perspective of the employer and the economics that ultimately govern the decision making of an H-1B, the genesis of the H-1B back in 1990 was to bring high-skilled talent from abroad into the United States because ostensibly the United States did not have the skilled workforce to fill those positions. America's biggest companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Oracle, they rely on these H-1B workers to come over, and they're able to pay them a certain amount. Those processing fees cost hundreds and then thousands of dollars. This is built into the calculation of how these companies ultimately structure their workforces, what type of investments that they make, and the ultimate innovation and development agenda that they'll be pursuing here in the United States. Imposing a $100,000 application fee is predictably going to impact how these companies now conduct the same calculation. Is it going to be worth it for them to be bringing over certain high-skilled workers from the Indian subcontinent into the United States if it simply doesn't make economic sense to do so? How much these jobs pay, for example, dramatically vary, right? And what we're ultimately going to see, even as this new processing fee is under legal scrutiny and legal challenge, is that the fee itself of $100,000 is actually going to be more than what some of these H-1B workers are going to be ultimately making. What this means from a decision-making perspective is we're going to see, at least in the short term, some calculation here of whether these companies end up not bringing some of these workers into the United States and instead offshoring some of the work to outside the American borders. I think that's the first thing and the immediate impact that we're going to ultimately see of these companies navigating this uncertainty and saying, hey, until we have a much more predictable and a much more stable environment against which we can operate, we may need to put a pause on this right now. Fewer visas that are ultimately going to be pursued means fewer applicants coming from the Indian subcontinent into the United States.